It started with a whisper in the music world. Joni Mitchell, the legendary songwriter whose words painted emotions, mentioned Van Morrison in a way nobody expected. For decades, their paths had crossed, two giants from the same golden era, both carving out their own space in the world of music. But Joni never said much about Van. She kept her feelings close, like she always did, until now. The story begins in the late 1960s. Joni was becoming a force in folk music, her songs like Both Sides Now and Chelsea Morning capturing the soul of a generation. At the same time, Van Morrison had just released Astral Weeks, a record that critics praised, but the public didn't fully understand yet. Behind the scenes, Joni and Van were circling the same orbit. They played festivals, shared stages, and knew the same people. But there was always tension. People in the scene noticed it. Two stubborn artists with strong visions. Joni, known for her sharp honesty, and Van, famous for his fiery temper and refusal to play by anyone's rules. The two respected each other, but admiration often came with silence. That silence lasted years. And then, one evening much later, Joni finally spoke about Van Morrison. Fans were stunned. What she said was not what anyone expected. It wasn't just about his music. It was about who he was, the way he carried himself, and how their lives collided in ways most people never knew. The question everyone had was simple. What did Van Morrison do that made Joni Mitchell finally break her silence after all these years? To understand Joni's shocking words, you have to know the world they lived in. The late 60s and early 70s were a chaotic time in music. Folk, rock, and jazz were colliding, and every young musician wanted to break boundaries. Joni was the voice of the personal, writing songs about heartbreak, freedom, and the beauty of human flaws. Van, on the other hand, chased something mystical. His songs were full of Belfast memories, street corners, and spiritual longing. But both Joni and Van shared one thing. They never fit neatly into the box the industry tried to put them in. Record labels wanted hits, radio wanted catchy songs, but Joni refused to write formula pop, and Van refused to play the industry's game. He was infamous for walking off stage if he didn't like the sound or the crowd. Joni, equally uncompromising, walked away from relationships and careers when they stopped feeding her art. They were kindred spirits, yet rivals at the same time. Fans noticed they rarely spoke of each other, even when asked. Some said it was respect. Others said it was jealousy, but those close to the scene whispered of private moments, backstage meetings where Van's fiery moods clashed with Joni's sharp tongue. And then, decades later, Joni's words revealed the truth. She didn't just talk about Van's music. She talked about his spirit, the part of him that was impossible to tame. And in that moment, fans realized she had been holding a story inside her for years, maybe even a confession. The shock wasn't just in what she said. It was in how personal it felt, and it left fans asking, did Joni admire Van Morrison, or did she secretly resent him? Joni Mitchell had always spoken her mind. She never cared about the spotlight, or what critics thought, or even what other musicians said behind her back. But when her name got tied to Van Morrison, the Irish singer who many called the Belfast Cowboy, things suddenly grew intense. Fans loved both artists, both were poetic, both were stubborn, and both had voices that sounded like no one else. But the problem was, their worlds collided in ways no one expected. Back in the 1970s, Joni was at her peak. She was playing to sold-out crowds, writing songs that defined an entire generation, and living in the heart of the California music scene. Van, on the other hand, was carving his own legend in a different way. Moody, soulful, and often keeping people at a distance. Where Joni opened her heart in her songs, Van kept his guarded, filling his lyrics with mystery. The two couldn't have been more different, yet somehow they kept being mentioned side by side. It started with whispers at parties. Friends in the music business noticed how both of them demanded perfection, how both refused to play by the rules, and how both seemed allergic to fame. But it wasn't until years later that Joni finally spoke out about what she really thought of Van Morrison. Her words surprised even her closest fans. She admitted that she respected Van's talent. How could she not? Songs like Into the Mystic and Moondance had moved millions. Yet Joni didn't stop there. She explained that behind the genius, she saw someone who pushed people away, someone who built walls even higher than she ever did. And in Joni's world, that wasn't just an artistic choice, it was a weakness. Fans were shocked. For decades, many had imagined Joni and Van as kindred spirits, two outsiders who spoke the same musical language. To hear Joni tear down that idea left listeners speechless. But Joni was never afraid of honesty. She believed that legends should be humanized, that the truth, even if it hurt, was better than a myth. What made this moment even more powerful was the timing. Joni was older now, reflecting on her life with a kind of clarity that only comes after years of struggle. She had faced illness, heartbreak, and the fading of her own voice, yet she still had the courage to speak openly. And when she looked at Van Morrison, she saw a mirror, but not the kind of mirror people wanted to imagine. She saw a man who battled his demons in public, and not always gracefully. The story didn't end there. Joni's comments about Van set off a firestorm of debate. Some fans agreed with her, saying Van's attitude had often been difficult to swallow. Others defended him fiercely, arguing that his brilliance excused his behavior. And in the middle of it all, Joni stood firm, reminding everyone that truth was more important than protecting reputations. But here's the question. Why did Joni choose this moment, after decades of silence, to finally speak about Van Morrison? The answer takes us deeper into her own journey, and it's not what anyone expected.